Hi, we're gonna get started. I hope everyone has their tablets and their laptops and everything. And also, if you haven't downloaded Photoshop, download it now, please, and also sign in. Okay. Oh God. Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Megan, and I'm part of the DigiPaint admin, and today is going to be our Basics of Photoshop workshop. And if this is your first time coming to DigiPaint, we're basically UMich's digital painting club, and we have casual and professional meetings every week where we bring in speakers, or we have workshops, or we have like casual, fun draw events. So yeah, come check us out. We have events weekly. So let's start with, what is digital art? Digital art is art that's created using software such as computers, tablets, and other electronic devices. It implements traditional aspects of art such as drawing, sculpture, painting, and using various materials. The difference between digital art and traditional art, though, lies in tools. So tools such as layers, blend modes, the lovely and vital undo button, color selection, opacity, and a variety of brushes allow artists to create unique effects that are much harder to recreate traditionally. It presents an opportunity to learn a new form of art, and despite what some people might say, digital art is real art. It's just as challenging. Oh God, thank you. Okay, sorry. Despite what other people might say, digital art is real art. It's just as challenging and rewarding to learn as any other form of art. There are many uses for digital art. Whether you're looking to join an industry where digital art is valuable or just want a fun hobby, the need and want for digital artists is ever increasing. Before we jump in, here are some of the other available software for digital art. iPad has Procreate, Clip Studio Paint, Photoshop with less assets, Medibang, and others. And the computer has Clip Studio Paint, Photoshop, Paint Tool Sci. Unfortunately, that's only Windows. Krita, Medibang, and again, many others. Our focus today will be on Photoshop. So some topics we'll cover today are setting up your canvas, navigating the interface, brushes, accessing and choosing colors, tools, tips, and tricks, and other resources. So here we're gonna jump into opening up Photoshop. Let me share that screen. Everyone can open up Photoshop now if you want to follow along, or if you choose, you can just watch. Has everyone opened up Photoshop? We're good? Okay. So let's start by creating a new file. Up in the top left corner, you'll see this blue button that says New File. You can click on it, or you can use the shortcut Command or Control-N. That'll pull up this dialog box, and we'll just start with a preset. We'll go to Art and Illustration, which is up in this top bar, and then we'll do 2000 by 2000 pixels. On the right here, you can see all of the settings for the preset. We won't go too much in depth for that, but you can change the width and the height of your canvas, and that's just like how you imagine a painting canvas or your sheet of paper. So we'll click Create, and it'll bring us to a new file. Hopefully all of your screens look something like this. If anyone's doesn't, please let me know. We can change that. Are we all good? Any questions? Okay. So now we'll start with navigating the interface. What is all of this stuff that we're looking at? So what's in the center here, this blank white square, that's our canvas. It's the area that we can draw on. On the left here are all of our tools. So for example, like the brush tool is here, if you can maybe vaguely see. And then on the right, or on top, will be all of the tool settings. So if you look at this top bar, you can click on these different buttons, and there are different settings for whatever tool you currently are using. On the left of your screen, we'll have a color picker up in the top right here. And then down here in the middle are adjustment layers. We'll go over all of these in depth later. And on the bottom should be layers, channels, and paths. For our sake, we're really only going to be worrying about layers. Any questions so far? We're all good on that? Okay. And I want to talk about some nice shortcuts and gimmicks that I like to work with. So one of the most important things is the hand tool. If you start zooming into your canvas just by using 2 fingers to zoom, or Command or Control plus, you'll see that part of the canvas is cut off. You can pan or move around the canvas by holding down spacebar and then clicking and dragging your screen around. So hold down space and then you can just drag around like this. And you can move around and see what things that are cut off. And then we already talked about zoom, which is also really important because you don't want to stay zoomed out or zoomed in all of the time. You want to be able to see details when you're working on details and then see how they fit in with the rest of the piece by zooming out. Okay, now we'll move on to layers. Layers, as I mentioned, are on your right in the bottom-ish corner, wherever my cursor went. They're here, and you can see that when you create a new file, you are started off with just one background layer. At the very bottom bar in this panel, you can create a new layer by clicking on this plus button. It's rather small, but you can also do Control-Shift-N or Command-Shift-N. So we'll start by doing that. And it'll pull up this pop-up, and you can name your layer. I don't usually do that until I figure out what the layer is for. And so some things I want to talk about are blending modes, clipping masks, and layer locks. But first we're going to move on to brushes, and then we'll come back to that. So brushes are what they sound like they would be. It's how you paint and how you draw. And you can use the hotkey B to switch to the brush, or you can access it by clicking on the brush icon on the left side toolbar. You can access all of your brushes by, do you guys see this icon on your right side where you can click on it and it'll pull up this box? No? Okay, then I might have added that myself. You can adjust your workspace and add different panels, but the default should also be in the top bar. If you look at this folder with the brush on it, it should pull up something. That worked? Okay, awesome. So with that, you can see all of your brush settings, and then you can also click on brushes to view all of your brushes. Do you guys see that? Okay. So this brushes is your list, is like a collection of all the different brushes that you have, and I think you should be given these general brushes, and dry media brushes, and all of those folders. You guys have default brushes, right? Cool. So there are a few different properties of brushes that we will go over. So the first of which is the brush tip shape. And that's like, you can imagine a normal paintbrush. You have just a round brush or a flat brush, and those also exist in Photoshop and digital painting. And so if you are looking at your list of brushes, you can see all of these different like icons or different shapes. If you go to brush settings, you can see the shape of the tip in this very small box here. I know you probably don't have all of these, but all of these different icons basically just have a different shape of the brush, and that'll create a different effect when you use it. For our purposes, we'll just deal with the default brushes. So if we go back to brushes, we'll just click on hard round pressure size. Does everyone see that? Okay, we'll just use that. And another property of brushes is the hardness of the brush. That's best demonstrated by just showing you. So let me pull up. So first we'll do a hardness with 100%. And I'll just do a giant dot. Hold on. So it looks like that if I just draw a circle. And then if I turn hardness down to 0%, it's like that. It basically just is what it sounds like, how hard the edges of your brush are. Next, we'll talk about size. And you can see that I resized my brush so that it has this giant tip instead of a tiny one. And you can change the size of your brush by using the square bracket icons. So the one on the left will make your brush size smaller, whereas the one on the right will make it bigger. Another important thing is pen pressure. And that's why having a tablet for digital art is really important, and you can't just use your trackpad or mouse. Because with pen pressure, you can basically change how large or small your brush tip is just by the pressure of your pen, basically. Like, since we use the hard round pressure size, that means that pen pressure is on. And if you go to brush settings, there's something called shape dynamics. That's exactly what pen pressure is. And there's just this area that says control, and then you have to set it to pen pressure, and you can have something like this. Oh God, wait. Like this, instead of just like that. Does that make sense? Awesome. The last property of brushes that we'll go over is opacity. And actually, a lot of these concepts apply to digital art in general and not just Photoshop. But how you access these tools and what the settings look like are kind of different depending on the program. So we change the brush opacity by looking in this top toolbar, and there's something called opacity. And you can drag on the word to lower or increase the opacity. So let's just lower it to like 50%. Now if I draw something, it looks gray, right? And if I draw over it again, you can see that the part that overlapped looks darker. And so what opacity is, it's basically how see-through something is. If it's 100%, then it's fully opaque. But if it's 0%, then you can barely see it, and you can see everything underneath it. Any questions on that? Okay. Now we're going to go back to layers a little bit and talk about blending modes. So I'm just going to create a new layer by clicking on that button, and we'll talk about blending modes. So what blending modes are is, if you look in the top area of the layers panel, which is in the bottom right, there's something that says normal. And if you open up that that box, it'll pull up all of these weird words like normal, dissolve, darken, multiply. And what those mean are it changes how the layers interact with each other. So if I just do normal and I draw, oh god, let's change the opacity back to 100, and I draw a black dot. If I make a new layer and then I draw like a red dot, you can see that you can't see most of the red, you can't see the red dot underneath the black one, but you can see the rest of it. How layers work are, you can think of them as transparent sheets of paper on top of each other. And so if you draw something, you can see what's underneath it. And blending modes will change how those interact with each other. So I'm actually going to change this back to, I'm going to make this 2 red dots, and we'll talk about blending modes. So right now, this top one is normal. Now we'll change it to something called multiply. So if you open up that box and you click on multiply, it might be a little hard to see on the projector, but if you do it on your own screens, it might be easier to see. You can see that the area that it's overlapping in is a darker red. What multiply does is it multiplies the values of the 2 layers. And so what it does in effect is that it makes whatever is overlapping darker. It's often used for shadows, like drawing shadows, because you can just use the same color and it'll just be darker. Now if we change it to screen, you can see that the top part of the first red dot is gone. That's because we're on a white background, and what screen does is it basically like keeps, it's the opposite of multiply, where it's used for highlights and it brightens an image or an area that it's overlapping in. And it's just a little weird with white and black. So if you do multiply with black, or if you do multiply with white, nothing will show up. And if you do multiply with black, or if you do screen with black, nothing will show up. It's just because of how the values are calculated. But you can see where the reds overlap, it's like this orange now. It's this brighter color. And then the last one we'll talk about is overlay. So if you open up that box again, we can see it again looks a little different. Let me actually just draw a couple different things so you guys can see the difference. So this one's overlay, this one's going to be multiply, and then this one is screen. Okay, so you guys can see the difference vaguely. You might have to play around with it on your own to really get the hang of it, because it's something that's kind of weird, and honestly the best way to understand how it works is just to play around with it. But how overlay works is it takes into account the colors that are actually on the layers. Whereas multiply is just, you multiply the values, and screen is just, it makes it brighter. Overlay does multiply or screen depending on the colors. And it can often be used to create like a glowing effect. So if I do another red dot, and then I do one over it, and I lower the hardness. Hold on. Let me change the background. Okay, that was really poorly done, but you can kind of see that it looks maybe vaguely that it's glowing. And so all of these blending modes allow you the chance, like, it lets you create these different effects with your layers. And there are so many other blending modes, but these 3 are the most common, and you can always Feel free to play around with the other ones on your own, and there are also great YouTube tutorials that go far more in depth about all of them. For now, we'll be moving on to colors. So if you look in the top right corner, you can see this color selection thing. So there are 3 different properties of color when it comes to digital art. There's hue, saturation, and brightness. And so the hue is the actual color, so like red, green, blue. Those are the different hues. And you can change it just by dragging this slider. It's a little hard to tell, but this is the color that's being changed. At any given point, you can have 2 colors that you can hold on to and draw with your brush. The first of which is on top, and that's the one, it's the primary one. And when you draw, it'll be using that color. Wait. But then the one underneath is just another color that you can hold on to, and you can switch to using that color by pressing X, and then now you get to use that one instead of the first one. And going back to hue, saturation, and brightness, hue is the color, saturation is how like vibrant or how colorful it is. So if I lower the saturation on this and I draw, it's much paler. It's not as saturated. And then lastly, brightness is how light or dark the color is. And so if I lower the brightness now, it's very dark, brownish gray. And so you can change your colors by using this color picker in the top right. And you can choose a color by clicking and dragging around here. But you can also select your values by changing these sliders. And it allows you to be a lot more precise with what you want, if you want something more saturated, or if you want to keep the same hue, but you want to change the brightness, for example. Sorry, I forgot to check. Does everyone see this type of color thing? Okay, sorry. If you look in the top right corner of this color panel, there's a hamburger like menu icon. Do you see that?
Yeah.
If you click on that, you can click on HSB sliders, and that's the one we're talking about.
Okay,
yeah, there are also different things. You can use something called Hue Cube, and you just select colors like that, or the color wheel. You can choose whichever one you like, but I just chose to use that one to show you guys all the different properties of color. Okay, now there's something called swatches. Swatches can be thought of as like your palette. Like if you have ever painted and you have a palette full of all your paints and colors, that's also a thing on digital painting. To be honest, I don't use it very often, and I'll explain why in a few seconds. But basically you can save colors and you can be able to select from them for easy access. And you create a new swatch by going down here. Could everyone see that? It looks like the same icon as creating a new layer, and you just click on that. It'll pull up this dialog box, and it'll create a swatch with whatever is your current color. Okay. The last thing about color I want to talk about is a tool called the Eyedropper Tool. It's how you can easily choose colors from what's already on your screen. So if you press I, which is the shortcut for it, or you can look on the left side of your screen again, and it's like the 6th or so down, it looks like an eyedropper. You can click on that, and then you can go to anywhere on your canvas. And if you click on a color, it'll choose that as your primary color. And so I really like to use the eyedropper instead of swatches. So often I will just have a layer and I'll just have dots of all the colors that I like using, and then I can use the eyedropper tool. Another easy way to use the eyedropper tool is by holding down Option or Alt, and then you can click on the color. Okay, now we'll move on to talking about some of the other tools. So first we'll talk about something called the Move tool. It's exactly like what it sounds like. It's the first tool on the left side bar, and you can also access it by pressing V. And it does exactly what it sounds like. You just move one of your layers. It'll move the whole layer at the same time unless you select just a portion of it. So you can see that this layer I have has 3 dots, right? And if I move it, it moves all 3 at the same time. I'm so sorry, I just realized I forgot to talk about something with layers, so I'm gonna jump back real quick. Also with layers, you can hide or show some layers. So like what I did right there was I clicked on this eyeball icon next to a layer, and it hides whatever is on the layer. It's really useful for figuring out what's on your layers, or just checking to see the difference between what you added now and what you had before. And there's also a few more things. There's something called a layer lock, where if you go to a layer and you click on this lock button, it looks like a bunch of pixels. It's next to the word lock. If you click on that, you'll see this lock icon on your layer. And so what that does is, now when you paint on that layer, you can only paint on what's already there. So this is the layer that has the 3 dots, right? And if I do like a bright blue, that will definitely be able to see a part. And I start painting, you can see that I'm trying to paint over here, but it's not working, and it's only showing up on what's already on the layer. It's such a great tool, and it's so useful for when you already have a figure like painted out and you need to add shadows or highlights or whatever, you know? And another thing that's really similar to that is something called a clipping mask. That's where you create a new layer, and then you hold down Option or Alt until you see this like icon when you hover over like the layer underneath it. And if you click, when you see this icon with like a square and an arrow, wait, it'll kind of slightly move the layer over, and you'll see this arrow pointing down to the layer underneath it. That makes a clipping mask, and what that means is everything you paint on this layer can only cover the area that's on the layer underneath it, that it's clipped to. So for example, this one is clipped to the layer of the 3 dots. And if I go in and start painting, it again only works on one of the dots that's already there. Does that make sense? It's pretty similar with like the opacity lock, but what's great is that you can do it with the new layer, and you don't have to paint over what you already have, and it's easier to erase and undo. Okay, now we'll move on to some other tools. Now we'll go on to Rectangle Select. It's right underneath the Move tool, and the shortcut for that is M, which kind of makes no sense, but they call it the Rectangular Marquee tool, which is why it's M. And now with that, if you press down and you start like drawing and moving your cursor, you see this like weird line. They call it marching ants. It kind of shows you the area that you'll be selecting. So if I let go, it shows this area, and that's the box that I've selected. And what that means is if I now try to use the Move tool, for example, it will only move the area that I selected. So it's only moving this 1 dot instead of all 3 like it did before. Similarly with that, if you hold down on this icon, the rectangle icon, it'll pull up this box and there's other different shapes that you can draw. So there's the elliptical, where it draws an oval or a circle. And now you've selected only that area. And the last select I want to talk about is the Lasso Tool. That's where you can draw your selection area. So you can have some wacky shapes. So if I want to do like, oh god, like this, I can select a weird shape that, you know, I can't do otherwise. And now I'll move just this weird little blob. What's great about the Lasso Tool is that you can select these weird shapes, and then what Select does is it makes it so that you can, if you paint, you only paint in your selected area. So now if I try to draw, wait, I have to get rid of this lock. It'll only work in my selected area instead of all of this. So far, so good? Making sense? Awesome. You can also use the Select tool to allow you to fill areas quickly, and we'll go over that in a second. So another thing that's really important is the Eraser tool, and you can access it by pressing E, or again through the toolbar on the left. It looks like an eraser, as you would expect. And what that does is it just erases things, and it is so important. And you can also change the different properties of an eraser just like you can with a brush. So you can change it to make it softer, so it's not such a harsh line, or you can make it so that the opacity is really low and you barely erase any of it. Now we'll talk about the bucket. It looks like a paint bucket, and it is great for filling in large areas. You can get to it by pressing G, or on the left, it's a bucket. And let me get rid of this selection real quick. If I use the paint tool, or the bucket tool on like a new layer. If I use the bucket tool on a new layer and I just tap, it'll fill that entire area with the color. Or if you use it with like the Lasso tool or the rectangular Select tool, it'll fill in your selection. And you can do that with your, obviously you can change your color. And finally, we'll talk about something called the Smudge tool. The Smudge tool is great for blending. So let me delete all of these layers real quick so it's a little cleaner. So if I want to blend, for example, like this blue color, oh god, what is going on? If I want to do this blue color with a bright red, that's not going to blend so well, but you can do it with a tool called the Smudge tool, and it's on the left side. It looks like a hand with a finger that's kind of smudging things. And when you have that tool up, let me increase the size of that. Oh god. I have a weird brush, hold on. And you start like drawing, it does this weird looking thing. Oh, hold on. It does this thing where it just smudges the two colors. It's not looking so great right now because of the colors I chose and just me going through it, but it works great if you're just trying to blend similar colors or for just soften some edges. So far, any questions on those tools? Yeah. Oh, no worries. This is the Smudge tool. It looks like a hand with like a finger out.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's used for like blending different colors. Cool? Awesome. Okay, so the last thing we'll be covering before we jump into a demo where we're drawing together is something called adjustments. So these are used more in photo editing, but it can also be really helpful in painting. Because say, for example, you color something red, and you have all the shadows and the highlights and everything refined, and then you decide, actually it would look much better blue. In that case, you can do something, you can use an adjustment layer and easily change the hue of that entire layer or your entire piece. So if you look in like the middle of the right side panel, there's something called adjustments, and you can hover over each of these icons to see what the name of them is. So there's something called Hue Saturation, and we can use that. And we'll just click on it, and it creates this new layer. And now it pulls up this box on the side where there are these 3 sliders with hue, saturation, and lightness. And so if we want to change the color of our piece, we just grab the slider, and you can see that it's changing all of the colors on the canvas. But what if we only want it to apply to just the layer with the 2 dots? We can do that by using the clipping mask that we learned about. And so if we hold down Option or Alt, and then we click on like the line between these 2 layers, now it applies only to the 2 dots. And the background color isn't changing when we move the slider. And so similarly with just the other properties of color, we can increase the saturation or decrease it. We can also change how bright or dark it is. And so this is just a really easy and fast way to change what color your piece is. Some of the other important adjustment layers we'll talk about are curves. These are great for changing. So curves you can basically do everything with, but they're a little complicated to get into. And so the main thing that I'll talk about is changing like the contrast of your piece or how bright certain areas are. So if you just grab like the middle of this and you pull down, you can see that the whole thing is getting darker. Or you can pull it up and it's all so bright. It basically just changes the lightness of certain areas of your piece. You can also drag like this bottom left point in the graph. If you drag it further, it changes what's considered black in your piece. And you can do that with up here too, and just change the white point. It's a little complicated, but I really just mess with it whenever I'm doing something, and it's a really fast way to increase contrast in your piece if you made everything too pale or your shadows aren't dark enough. You can just mess with your curve, and you can make it darker, or brighter, or whatever you need. So those are the main 2 that I use and I think are most important. So before we jump into the demo, are there any questions on what we've covered or anything that you maybe have heard about but wanted to know more about? Awesome. How familiar are all of you with like drawing in general? Have you guys done drawing before? Okay, awesome. And digital art, are you guys familiar with it at all, or are you pretty much like new? Okay. So I was thinking let's pull up this picture. Hold on. I was thinking we could just do a quick study of a picture I found on Unsplash. Oh god, why is it an Illustrator file? Hold on.
Chat is asking if
Yes.
Photoshop has a magic wand tool.
Yes, it does actually. Okay, so actually, I guess before we move on to the demo, Someone in chat asked about a magic wand tool. It's very similar to the selection tools that we've talked about, but it makes everything easier, basically. If you look at the left-hand side next or right underneath the lasso tool, there's like this brush with like a selection area. Does everyone see that? If you click on that and you hold, it'll pull up this box with these 3 options. We're gonna look at the magic wand tool. It really is pretty magical. I think the name fits. So if you tap on something, like an object you've drawn, it selects, it uses AI to select what it thinks is one object, if that makes sense. So I tapped on the blue side of this, and now you can see that it's selected only the blue areas. It's not perfect, but it tried its best, and it did pretty well. You can also try it on the red side, or if you do it on like an actual photo, it probably works better than just on these 2 weirdly smudged dots. But then similarly, you can also use something called the quick selection tool. It's back in that same area, and you hold down, and you can select that. This one is more if you want to select an area, you can like just hover, like you can trace it basically, and it'll magically select the object for you. It's also very similar to the magic wand, but I personally prefer it a little bit more to the magic wand because it gives you more control. Because you can then go back in with like, if you look at this top area, there's another brush, and there's like a small minus sign. If you click on that and you start drawing, you can deselect some of the area. I personally just think it gives you a lot more like refinement and control over what you've selected than the magic wand tool. But they're both great. All of these selection tools are so great. Okay, so we will just start by creating another new file. So if you close out of whatever you had before, you can choose whether or not you want to save it. Maybe if you had just the dots, you don't need to save it. We'll go back to art and illustration, and let's just do the 18 by 24 poster preset. Why not? So we'll click create. Has everyone created a new file? We're good on that? Okay. Now we can open up our reference image in another file by doing Command or Control O, and that'll pull up your file finder. And you can navigate to wherever you saved the photo, and it'll open it up. Did everyone get that? Are we a little lost? Again, I sent the photo in the DrawJam channel of our Discord if anyone's having trouble finding it. Yes, what's up? Yeah, if you are on if you're on Photoshop, you just use Command or Control O to pull up your file finder, and you can open up the image. Yeah. You can also look at the top toolbar, and you can do File Open. I just really like using keyboard shortcuts. Okay, now that everyone has it opened up, I want everyone to pull up their top Photoshop bar. If you can see it, it has all of these things like Photoshop, File, Edit, etc. We'll go to Window, Arrange, and then 2 up vertical. What that does is it pulls up the 2 files you have open and it makes it side by side. I find it really helpful if I'm using a reference image, and you can resize your windows with the bar in the middle. Again, that's in the top bar, and if you go to, it's in Window, Arrange, and then 2 up vertical. Obviously later on, you guys can always use your own method of how you want to have your reference image up, but this is how I prefer it. Okay, now with that, we can probably just start drawing. So we'll start by figuring out, by sketching. And so when we sketch, or when I sketch, I like to figure out the shapes of whatever figure or whatever I'm drawing. And so if you're looking at this file, let's use a hard round pressure size brush and have the size pretty small, like 20-ish. And you can change your color to black so we can use that for our sketch. And right now, if we're clicked on our reference image, you guys don't have to do this, but you can, but I'm just gonna show you guys the shapes of the character, of the person. So if we're looking at her head, it's got this like, oh, you cannot see that. Let's use white. You can see that it's like this kind of shape, right? This, don't know what that's called. It's a shape. And then you can see her hair is this like trapezoidal kind of thing. And her body is something like that. It's just like, it's kind of like a rectangle. And so I like to block out these shapes first to see what the general shapes of my piece that I'll be making. And so now if we go back to our blank canvas, we can create a new layer again by doing Command N. Oh shoot, not Command N, sorry, Command Shift N, or by using this button down here that looks like a square with a plus in it. Also, just as a heads up, we probably will not finish this, but we'll try to get as far as we can. And if you would like to keep working on it, like later in your own time, and you have questions, feel free to send them in our questions channel. I believe we should have that up soon. And then you can share your art in the Share Your Art channel. Okay, so now we'll start by sketching. We'll just draw out this shape that we already determined. So that'll be her face, and I like to draw where like the middle of her face is, where the nose and the mouth and the eyes will be centered around. So it's something like that. And then I like drawing the eye line, the nose line, and the lips. So it's something like that. And then we'll do the hair. Oh god, she's looking a little like the character from Emperor's New Groove. We'll work on that. And then right now we're just blocking out general shapes, so if it's a little rough, that's okay. And if you want, if you realize you've drawn things too big or too small, you can use something called the transform. So if you use Command T, it pulls up this box, and then you can resize whatever you have. And it's great, and I use it all the time. So I'm just gonna shrink that a little bit. And then add in the neck and the body. Something like that. Something like that. It's a little rough. But after we have like these general blocks in, we can go in and start sketching some of the details. And you can zoom there's a couple different ways. So there was the Command or Control plus or minus. I personally have really started to like using Command space, like holding on those two buttons. I do space command first because otherwise it'll pull up Spotlight, which is also really annoying. But if you hold down those two buttons, then you can drag your pen to zoom in or zoom out. I really like that. It just seems a lot faster than moving your hands, so command plus. And now we can start adding a little bit more detail and figuring out the other shapes. Is everyone still working on the sketch? It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just kind of getting some more details on what we have. If you're not done with the sketch, don't worry, you can keep working. I'm just gonna start moving forward a little bit for the sake of time so that I can go over more of the process than just sketching. So once you have like a general sketch down, you can start blocking in the colors. And depending on what style you want to go for, sometimes you'll have like very inked lines, right? And you can keep your lines, but other times you want to have this like fully rendered painting that doesn't have lines. And that's fully up to you guys to decide. I'll probably keep these lines for now just so I can make it a little messier and I don't have to worry about having perfect lines. So we can start by blocking out colors, and what's great about having your reference photo up in Photoshop is that you can now use the Eyedropper tool on your reference photo to pick out the exact colors that they have. And so we can actually start with the background. We'll just hold down Option or Alt, and we'll go over to the left side of our screen, click that yellow, and now we have that yellow selected, and we can go back to our background layer, grabbing our bucket tool with G, and then just pressing down. And it'll fill the whole canvas with that color, or that whole layer. And now we can grab the skin color by doing the same thing, and we can create a new layer. I like doing it between my sketch and the background layer, so that way it's underneath the sketch, and the sketch shows up on top, but it's on top of the background so that you can actually see what you're painting. So now we'll just go in and get the general shape of the color. Don't worry too much about making it perfectly match your lines, because you can just put a layer over it with the hair layer, and it just covers up all of that stuff. So now if we create another new layer and we have it above that skin layer, we can pick out the color for the hair, and we can cover up all the area that should be covered. This can still be pretty rough shape since we're still in a pretty early stage of our painting, and we'll always go back and refine our shapes, our edges, our lines. Painting is always a very iterative process. And so finally, we will go back and grab the shirt color. And I would probably put this underneath the hair. If you look at the reference, you can see that some of the shirt is actually like in front of the hair. So you can choose to either have the clothes on like 2 separate layers, and you can kind of sandwich the hair layer, or you can just have it on 1 layer and be more precise about where you're painting. I'll just keep it on 1 layer. And this is also actually a great time to use a Lasso Select tool, because you can kind of draw out this shape and then just use the paint bucket to fill it. You can also, of course, just use your brush tool and paint the shape, but using the Lasso tool tends to make it a little faster. So now we can just use the Lasso tool and we can draw whatever shape we're looking for. So this is the shirt. I'm just going to follow this line. All the way around. And once I have that selected, I can just use the paint bucket tool with G, and voila, that whole area is covered. And if your selection wasn't perfect, you can always go back in, erase, and you can use the brush tool to fix up that shape. And if you've zoomed in too far, you can use Command or Control 0, and that resets your zoom back to 100% so you can see the full canvas. And so now we have all of our colors blocked in. It's starting to kind of look like her. And at this point, you can start adding like your shadows and your highlights. I start by doing flat colors just to see where the light is coming from and where all of the shadows and highlights are. So what flat color means is it's just 1 color. It's like hard edges. It's not refined at all. And so we'll start by making yet another new layer. If you want to be more organized than I currently am being, you can also double click on the layer name, which is like layer 2, for example, and it'll highlight it, and then you can rename your layer. So you can like name the skin layer skin, and then that way you know what's on your layers. I tend to not name my layers until it's very late and I'm getting very confused with my layers. So the best practice is to do it as soon as possible and every time you make a layer. So I'll just do that real quick. Here. And then lines. And so now we will have a new layer for, let's see, our skin shadows. And that'll be between the clothes and the skin. And now we can create a clipping mask with this layer so that we are only painting on the skin area. So hold down Alt or Option, and then do that weird thing we did earlier where you click on the line between the layers while holding down Alt or Option. And it should push the layer to the side, and you should see this arrow pointing down. Did that work for everyone? It's by holding down Option or Alt and then clicking between the layers. Clipping masks will only work with the layer directly below it, or you can have multiple clipping masks. So if I create another layer and I also want this to be only on the skin, I can do the same thing of holding down Option, and both of these layers now are clipped to the skin layer. But if I want to have like a layer between them not clipped, that won't work. It will unclip whatever is on top, if that makes sense. You can test it and play with it if that helps. So we actually only need one of those layers. So I'm going to delete that, and now we can start blocking out the shadows. We can go back to using our eyedropper tool. Oh, using the eyedropper tool with Option or Alt only works if you have your brush tool selected. Just a heads up. Actually, I might have lied with that. No, I think I'm right. It doesn't work with the eraser though. You can also use a soft brush if you think that'll work better. So I'll actually probably go in with a softer brush. So if you guys saw what I was doing with like blending the colors a little bit, I use one color and then, here, let me redo that actually so I can show you. So I start by having like this color here, right? And I want to blend that out because the shadow doesn't look like that and it's not that harsh. And so what I'll do is I'll start using a soft brush, so like soft round pressure opacity. And what that name means is that it's a soft brush where the hardness is 0%, and then pressure opacity is where how hard you press down with your pen is how opaque what you're drawing will be. So if I switch to that right now and I just barely press, you can see how it's barely showing up. But then if I press much harder, it'll show up like this. So that's really helpful for blending because you can make much softer edges. And now what I'm doing is, because it's not fully opaque, you'll see that the color is kind of mixed with what's underneath it. And you can use the eyedropper tool to select that, and then you can keep blending it that way, if that makes sense. And you kind of just keep selecting back and forth between the dark and the lighter color, or one color and the other color, and you just keep painting over it until it looks like it's blended. Okay, so a few final things. So we'll send out these slides later, but I have like a short playlist of some tutorials that I really like on digital painting in general. And then these are also some free brush sets that I use. They're linked, and they're from like artists Guways and Lowish. I don't know if you guys know them. I think they're all pretty great. And if you guys have any questions on how to import brushes, you can search it up, or feel free to ask it on the Discord, and I'd be more than happy to answer them. Oh, yes. Also, there is a graphic that has all of the Photoshop shortcuts that I live and die by. I found this online. It's great, and it's linked. And then finally, here is a feedback form if you guys would like to give feedback on how this went so we can improve it for next time. Yeah. Thank you for coming, everyone.